Hello, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. Um, I'm John Atack, despite everything. And this is my really dear friend and colleague, Hoyt Richards. How lovely to see you, Hoyt.
Good to see you, John. Good to see you.
And isn't it great having this excuse to talk to each other?
It is. It is. It's actually kind of a unique thing that I've really come to treasure because I look
Mm.
forward to it. And I've gotten to know you so much better, and that's been really fun. I always learn so much. I've got a stack of books I'll probably never get to, but you're the resource, the encyclopedia of books I should tackle. So I always appreciate that. But I also just love you and just think that you are a good man, and so I'm happy to have you in my life on a consistent basis. So thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you too. I love you too, and I
Yeah.
know that you too are a good man, and there aren't enough of us around, um, ultimately.
Well, hopefully, at least not meeting up, every 6 weeks or so and having a nice chat. So we're in rarefied air, right?
We are indeed. So
Yeah.
I'm I'm working on a book. You're working on a book. We tend to
Yeah.
work on books and
Yeah.
documentaries and things like that. I'm not really sure why. It just seems to happen that way. It's probably natural selection. That's probably what did it.
Well,
Um,
I was told when I went to um, the Wellspring place, which was like a
mm,
rehab for, cult survivors, that the creative arts was the best way to kind of rebuild one's self-esteem when you've been through anything traumatic.
mm,
That the creative arts are really something that in whatever way it expresses itself, it can be writing, it can be performing, it can be painting, it can be, sculpture, whatever it may be, anything that you can create, that you start to realize that your your biography is contributing to the point of view that you have to express yourself
mm,
artistically.
mm,
And that this segment of your life, like for both of us, we joined groups and we're in it for only a part of our life, but a significant part. But you start to recognize that even that part has become part of the creative engine that
mm,
fuels your creative energy. So it's a really powerful thing, I think, to, do something creative after
mm.
what we've all been through. And, I know you weren't as traumatized as some of the rest of us were out there, but
I was lucky.
it's still something that feels the need to express itself in some way. So I think writing's a great way to do it. I certainly know I enjoy talking about it. I love making films about these related themes. So yeah, it just seems to be the thing to do.
Yeah, and it's part of the process of digestion. I think
Yeah,
so many people walk away from a group and they think, oh well, um, that's it. That
yeah,
th
yeah,
my faith has evaporated. I'm no longer involved with that. So, I mean,
yeah,
investigating Charles Manson, which I've been doing for far
yeah.
too long now, um, people say, "Oh, well, one writer after another." Well, and then he became disillusioned with Scientology and left. And you're
Right,
going, "No, it doesn't quite work that way. It's not. Oh, I believed in the Easter Bunny, and now I don't believe in the Easter Bunny. It's
right,
these behaviors, this complex, incredibly complex set of beliefs was injected into you, and you have to become conscious of that. And there's no need to be frightened of it. It's not going to eat you. It's not a separate person inside you that is trying to run things, which of course is the basic idea of Scientology and much
yeah,
psychotherapy and many religions. You've got a demon or billions of body thetans inside your own. It's not like that. You've not got a, but you do have something that could be compared to a program, so that
mm,
you will tend to think within the terms of the group. You'll, even if you get away from the language of the group, you'll still tend to have those ideas. So, for example, in Scientology, one of the ideas that Hubbard's puts forward is that people only ever get upset with each other when there's a third party, when there's somebody else who's riling them up,
oh, I
and
see.
which is called
Yeah,
triangulation by psychologists. Now, while that is one of the reasons that people become upset with each other, I can become upset with somebody just because they're incredibly rude to me. It
sure.
doesn't
Right,
take somebody
yeah,
say, "Oh, he's being incredibly rude to you." It's
right,
or if somebody is offensive towards me in some way, or they have an offensive point of view. So we have something that's put forward as a truth, and people go away from the group saying, oh yeah, the only reason that other people are getting upset is because somebody's stirring it in the background. Well, there may be, there may not be.
That's
And
right.
we get these absolute ideas. Hubbard said absolutes are unobtainable, but he also gave us lots of them to believe in. So another one, which is really complicated, is the missed withhold, which is a mouthful. And the idea is that we have withholds. These are undisclosed transgressions. These are things we don't talk about, we keep secret about ourselves. And a missed withhold is when we think somebody might have guessed what we've done. And the only reason that people become hostile or critical is because they have missed withholds. And it's like, no, the reason I'm hostile and critical towards Adolf Hitler is not because I think he knows anything about me. It's because he was an asshole.
Right.
And the same with Ron Hubbard, frankly. So those things will continue to play out until you challenge them. And you don't have to challenge everything you believed, but so many people just walk away and say, I don't believe it anymore.
Right.
And it's not that simple.
No, it's not. And one of the things you and I talked about that I think is an important component to even before even getting to that point is what makes you stay as long as you stay, right? Like what makes you hang in, until the point you do decide, okay, I either don't want to be here or I've lost faith in these beliefs, right? And what comes, what comes behind that. And I think that's an important part that you certainly raised and I certainly talk about that I think often gets left out in these stories because everyone wants to know when you leave, but it's also important for, I think, to gather some empathy for the victim who's gone through this is to understand what made you stay, so that we get an understanding of what you thought you were getting involved with. Usually, that's usually I certainly know when I talk about what made me stay. I thought I had found my tribe. I thought I had found these like-minded people that saw me and heard me the way I wanted to be seen and heard, and this was also great. And then, I can now say, looking back in retrospect, the actual atmosphere for the group was not one that fostered friendship on any level, and the idea that this was my spiritual family was something that was projected onto me and onto the group, but was not earned on any level. Was just told. I was just told, now that you're part of this, these are your, spiritual brothers and sisters, and you're going to fight to the end, side by side in this valiant, effort we have, and that just was not accurate because there was also, and I know you have this in Scientology, this whole watchdog aspect to it of where you've got to watchdog each other, and it was certainly expected and not demanded that you would tattletale on each other, all under the guise to uplift and make us better people. But it was just what I experienced within that context was just betrayal over and over and over again. And friends don't do that to each other. That's not what friendship is based upon. And, you as a friend, you want to be able to embrace conflict and get honest opinions from someone, but not to the point, where you have a context like I experienced where people would team up and it'd be like a mob and everyone's got to throw stones at you. And if you don't throw a stone, and a verbal stone in essence, then the mob can turn on you. So that's not an environment that fosters any kind of real alliance or loyalty or friendship. It's quite the opposite. But you're being told this is the way it works. This is what it takes to become a spiritual family. This is how a spiritual family behaves. And it only took me 20 years to figure out that's not what I wanted to be a part of. Yeah.
And we look to belong. We want to be part of something. And there is an exception, psychopaths and people with the schizoid tendency don't feel the need for others. I suppose psychopaths do feel the need for others to abuse us, but that sense of belonging, that sense of being within, and I think it's good to look at it from different perspectives. Yes, it's a tribe, and it becomes tribal.
Right.
Yes, it's a family that we adopt. Our friends are the siblings we adopt, or
right.
cousins we adopt or whatever. But it can also be compared to a marriage, that you can find yourself, and I have a little experience of this, you can find yourself in a marriage where you're not at all happy with what's happening and the way things are going, but you're committed.
Right.
And so
Right.
within a cult group, you can feel that commitment and go, I will try and make it better, which was very much my last 6 months or so in Scientology, was me complaining and saying, this is wrong and we need to
Right.
change this. But I was most certainly not going to go to the news media or complain to
Right.
anybody who was not involved in Scientology. This was strictly ethically, I was going to
Right.
go to the Continental Justice Chief because my friend, my dear friend, Ira Chalef, had been declared suppressive. And so I complained and complained for 6 months and then went to Ira and said, introduce me to the other suppressives. Who else is on the list? And met some delightful people, some
Right.
really sweet, clever people. But that belonging, and as you say, there's this sense of, you're reporting for the good of the community. If you see any indiscretion or any criticism of the group, it's to be reported. Right. I was surprised after I left Scientology because there's a system in Scientology called knowledge reports or ethics chits, and I wasn't really very keen on it. So I didn't really, somebody had to do something quite severe before I would write one of these. I think in 9 years I probably wrote 3 of them.
Right. Right.
And I was the subject of very few as well, I'm happy to say. But when I, having left Scientology, I'm reading yet again the history of the Nazis, and you find out that the Gestapo had this same system functioning, and that kids would write reports on their parents. You're kind of going, no, this is not the kind of society I really want to be in. Thank you very much.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. As the old adage says, who guards the guardians, right?
Yeah.
When you're
Yeah.
accumulating information like that, well, who gets to decide who looks at it? And then, what are the ethics behind the people who are supposedly looking after it all?
And a friend of mine worked in Iraq in the detention centers there.
Right.
And was horrified to find that the women, she was in a women's camp, that women were being sent there because one of their neighbors had written one of these reports. There were no trials. There was just, I'm a Shiite, you're a Sunni, I'm a Sunni, you're a Shiite. And the devastating consequence that it's not entirely clear, I'm not sure there are any studies, but you are considered to be a jailbird in the community once you've been in one of these places. So you've been ruined, just like that, because of an allegation that is like a Scientology knowledge report, Gestapo report. Also, with the Gestapo, people were, when the occupied countries, people were so willing to pour scorn on their neighbors, to try and get their neighbors arrested, that the Gestapo couldn't keep up with the amount of reports they got.
Well, that reminds me of, I don't know if you've ever seen this documentary, The Art of Killing, I believe it's called.
We've talked about this before. I was going to ask you about it today. Yeah.
Yeah, because
in Indonesia, is that right?
Indonesia, right. And so under the guise of the fear of the spread of communism, they had these local tribunals, and it's, I can't remember in great detail, but I think it was fairly arbitrary who got to run these tribunals. But in essence, someone would make an allegation that someone was communist, and then they would be brought in for this interview. And within that interview, which might not last very long at all, they could determine from their point of view that you are a communist and you went through that door and were executed. And they couldn't keep up with the numbers of people that needed to be executed. So they actually hired the local gangsters to do the killings. And these people were painted within their society. The people actually orchestrating the executions became local heroes because they were, extricating, communists from their community, and they guessed like up to 20 million people were killed in that, through the 60s. And it's not something that we're ever aware of. But I mean, that goes back to what we're talking about. You put the power in a handful of just someone who gets to decide someone's life. And more often than not, they can exercise extreme cruelty. I mean, that you wouldn't even imagine.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I mean, I'm writing a chapter about eugenics at the moment, and looking again at the T4 program, the Nazi program,
right.
that they kill perhaps 200,000 people for being
Mm,
deaf, for being blind, being crippled, um,
wow.
and the upshot is it's a completely false idea because the heritability of these things is way more complicated. So, for
Right.
example, huge amount of schizophrenics were also part of a program of extermination. Perhaps 250,000 people were
Wow.
exterminated on the with the idea that schizophrenia will be passed on, and so we're getting rid of it. Well, I believe the incidence of schizophrenia in modern Germany is the same as it was then. We haven't, they didn't, despite this massive program, they didn't do anything positive. What they did do was make a whole society inhumane. And,
Wow.
you got to go in Indonesia. Maybe if they'd imprisoned the gangsters rather than using them as executioners, they'd have had a better
Yeah.
society. Um,
Yeah, it's a fascinating story and one that I think everyone should be at least aware of. I mean, it's more certainly not taught about that in the schools. I was not. I mean, that's genocide. 20 million people. I mean, that's extraordinary. And in the 60s, not that that's more recent than any major war, since World War II. So,
yeah, we've had, Pol Pot and the Rwanda murders, East Timor.
right, right.
Um, it just keeps on going, and I think you're absolutely right. It's about schooling. It's about
Yeah,
teaching kids um, humanity. It's
yeah,
about
it is. It is, and it also reminds me of this is a bit of a tangent, but it's related. I've had a lot of friends and even family members who are dyslexic. And that's something that's completely misunderstood from a public point of view. It's labeled as a disability, but it's not really a disability at all, in the sense that when you are dyslexic, you're going to always be challenged how to read, or how to read fast. I'll put it that way.
yeah,
You can figure out how to read, but it's challenging for you. The letters switch and jumble and all these sort of things happen. But dyslexics do figure out a way to do it. And I went to this fundraiser at one point and for dyslexia, and they said that within children or just the populace, you could say, you have to think of it like a spectrum. But 1 in 10 people have some form of dyslexia
yeah,
within that spectrum. So this, the fundraiser was saying that in this community, of which there were 600,000 children, there was only one school. No, yeah, there were 600,000 children that were dyslexic. Basically, there were 6 million children. So 600,000 had some form of
mm,
dyslexia. There was only one school for 200 kids that treated dyslexia. So the way they painted the whole issue was it's not really a disability, but by any point of view, because to figure out how to read for the dyslexic requires such a high-minded ability to problem solve that these people become some of the best problem solvers we have on the planet.
yeah,
But because the reading is challenging for them, they get labeled as lazy or stupid or resistant, or because they're struggling. They don't know. They don't know. They haven't been diagnosed to say you've got this issue.
mm,
You're okay. This is just this component of the way your mind works, and the way their mind works is such an extremely positive way of being a problem solver that we're actually missing out on elevating these great problem solvers that are out there and not allowing them to thrive. And because once diagnosed, most dyslexics really thrive.
mm,
It's just finding out what they're dealing with. And
yeah.
I think so much of this is like that.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I am absolutely confident people comment on my memory and the range of factoids that I accumulate.
Right.
And I know why. And it's because as a child, I realized that I didn't learn in the way that other kids did. And
Mm.
I therefore set up my own way of learning, of
Yeah.
registering information. And, I've seen it with one of my kids. He's amazing at maths. But at school, he got bored with the way
Right.
they taught maths. And he was about 9 years old when he learned the Indian math system. So he can do almost anything in his head, no matter how
Wow.
complicated, he can do it in his head. And that's because that system fitted with the way he thinks, the way he sees the world. And so,
Right.
yeah, I think that there's so much of the one size fits all cookie cutter approach because I have a sleep disability and so-called disability. There you go, disorder. Um,
Right.
and it's genetic. I've
Right.
spoken about it frequently, but about 30% of people, it's now reckoned, have eveningness or have some tendency towards being night owls. And
Right.
the reality is that melatonin and blue light don't actually solve this problem. And you can have very serious problems. You'll have memory problems, concentration problems, immune
Right.
system problems if you sleep at a time that doesn't suit your brain and body. And very recently, about half of your brain cells are glial cells. You've got 3,300 different kinds of neuron doing all their business, all this stuff, all this great
Wow.
stuff. Glial cells, we know the word means glue. We know almost nothing about them. And recently, work's come out from sleep labs saying, the glial cells are cleaning everything up. And if you don't get sleep at the right time, they won't work properly. So we can now connect sleeping at the wrong time with all sorts of mental illnesses, that it makes
Wow.
everything worse, and with a variety of physical problems. So finding out what your internal, innate, inborn sleep cycle is can be very important. When
Right.
I live within that, there is no disability. And
Right.
normally society, particularly sleep clinics, will force you to go in the morning, but there you go.
Right.
Because they don't understand these things.
Yeah.
But apart from those few official functions where you're forced, I have a normal day, but my
Right.
normal day begins at noon. And
Right.
after having 7 or 8 hours of sleep, like other people, I function pretty well.
Right. Yeah.
Considering my great age and all of that, I can even remember my name sometimes.
Well, that's good. Yeah.
It's very
Yeah.
good, yeah.
Yeah.
But if you take me out of that, then I don't function properly. The same is true with people who are dyspraxic, dysnumeric, dyslexic,
Right.
or whatever, that there is often a compensating factor, and sometimes it can be wrong, a bad thing. So that if you, for example, are genetically immune to malaria, you will
Right.
very probably, you have a high chance of having sickle cell anemia. So sometimes with
Right.
dyslexics, often they can memorize huge amounts of material
Right.
and they can synthesize material in a different way to people who are kind of tied to the words on the page. So they
Right.
can be more creative sometimes and more imaginative. And
That's
I
correct.
do see a tendency in education to blinker people, to
Yeah.
make us think in a particular way and not think outside the box.
Yeah. I mean, actually, there was a documentary about dyslexia called The Bigger Picture, because
Mm.
they're able to see, dyslexics are able to see from a much wider kind of 10,000 foot view,
Yeah.
which is why they're such great problem solvers, because they've had to do that to figure out this thing that all of us find a bit easier called reading. And so yeah, when you've got problems to solve, reach out to a dyslexic friend, and they'll be probably better to solve it than we will. So keep your dyslexic friends very close to you because they're real assets. It's something we have to reframe this whole thing around dyslexia because they're really some of the most extraordinary problem solvers on the planet. And
Mm.
sad thing is largely it goes undiagnosed, and people who even have the issue don't even know it sometimes, which is really sad.
It's true. I mean, my son's incredible guitar teacher. My son, dad, is an amazing guitar player now.
Right,
But the guy who's been teaching, who was his teacher, who I've known for years, is dyslexic.
Right.
And I think that it allows him to focus more intensely, perhaps, on music than most people do. I mean, it's like Ray Charles, that it was said with Ray Charles, he could have a 12-piece band. They'd rehearse through a number, and then he'd tell every person in the band exactly where they made a wrong note.
Wow.
And,
Wow.
what the note was, because he was
That's
pitch
like
perfect.
Mozart. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
incredible.
Yeah, Mozart with Allegre's Miserere, which I recommend that everybody rush out and listen to, 'cause it's a beautiful piece. But it was only sung within the Vatican chapel, and I think to this day there is no transcription published of the original Allegre. We have it because Mozart heard it once and wrote it down, and Mendelssohn later heard it once and wrote it down, and those are the two transcriptions that are used for this very complex piece of sung music, which is, I think it has 4 melodies running through it, 4 voices. So they're listening to 4 different parts, and they're able to put them down. I can just about pick out the 4 different voices, but the idea of being able to write them down,
Wow, that's
brilliant.
Extraordinary.
So you and I, we are unusual, and I hate to say this.
Yes, I think we can both say that. Yes, yeah.
And in this particular instance, we both left the groups we were in because we believed. We didn't leave because we'd stopped believing. You believed that you would be harmful to the group because you weren't good enough. And so you still believed. I left because I thought Ron Hubbard was dead and that these nasty Commodore's messengers had taken over. So it was because of my belief that I left. And I found myself in a peculiar situation in that I was at the middle of the UK independent Scientology movement, and about half of the membership left between 82 and 84. And I had something to do with that. But we were getting people out of the mother cult to carry on doing Scientology. We believed it was a great thing. And
we're gonna do it the right way, so to speak. Right? Yeah.
So the first thing was that the price dropped very dramatically to maybe a tenth of what the Scientology organization was charging, and that groups managed to run quite well on that amount of cash. So it showed how much was being wasted. And then you kind of go, well, yeah, with Ron Hubbard skimming off 90% of it, of course it cost a lot more.
Exactly that.
This is a guy who had attaché cases with $100,000 in each one, stacked up by his bedside just in case he had to do a runner quickly. For years, this was the case. I talked to people who smuggled money for him out of his Swiss bank, and stuff like this.
Goodness.
My journey out was really unusual because I absolutely fervently believed I'd not been abused or humiliated. I was never a live-in member. I was fine with Scientology except for just one thing, and that was I'd done the top levels, the vaunted operating Thetan levels. I'd done 5. There were 7 available at that time. 6 was a course to train you on 7, which was just more of 5. It was more getting rid of indwelling little beings, body Thetans. And I was fine until I got into those levels, and I just started going, this doesn't make sense to me. It must be right because Ron Hubbard says it's true, but I'm not really getting any benefit. I was really shocked after I did OT3 that I went in and said, I don't think this has really changed anything. I don't feel.
So when you say it didn't make sense to you, it was meaning that when you would apply it, you didn't see a change, or it just seemed to be irrational or illogical? What would you say?
The material itself seemed irrational. That being told that all of my problems derived from something that happened 75 million years ago, where the evil Prince Xenu, galactic overlord Xenu, had rounded up the populations of 176 planets and brought them here to Earth, to Tigiak as it was then, blown them up in volcanoes on the Canary Islands and Hawaii, neither of which existed 75 million years ago. Actually, they're both eruptions of about 9 million years ago, I believe. So bit of a problem there with the location. But this this idea that we were then implanted for 36 days with images pretty much of 1966. You know, all of the pictures that Hubbard brought out from there were, and so since then we've actually been innovative, but everything up to
Yeah.
1966 was implanted. And that included the idea that Christianity was completely implanted, the religious
Hmm.
belief was implanted. We were basically robot zombies, you know, inhabited by millions of little beings that had
Right.
got these mad ideas. And I don't know, it just seemed a little odd to me. It was not, you know, the 7 years leading up to that had not been about that. There was a certain amount of space opera, but you were
Right.
dealing with things that seemed to be fairly rational, you know, that you got rid of trauma from your past and that would make you feel better. And you learned
Right.
how to control your attention. You know, there's a technique called the locational in Scientology, where you look at things and touch things. Psychologists call it grounding. It works either way,
Right.
whatever you call it. Um, but
Well,
coming away,
would
sorry, go
you,
ahead.
just a quick question. I'm kind of curious, looking back and what you know now, and I'm sure this is a challenging question to answer, but the percentage of the information you got exposed to, if you had to put it in a percentage, which percentage would you say was actually legitimate and the rest was kind of confusing and inaccurate or not useful or a bunch of hogwash, you know?
Well, I don't believe there's anything in Scientology that I find useful anymore. Um,
Hmm.
Part of that is because some of it, as I said, with the third party or the missed withhold, some of it's just nonsense. You
Right.
know, the only reason a student gives up a study or becomes confused is because of the misunderstood word. No, it
Right.
isn't. And that's written at the beginning of every Scientology book. It's not true. But I used dictionaries before I got into Scientology. So I knew looking up words was a good idea. And that's often the thing that there's something that, yeah, might have some value, but it comes from somewhere else. And
Right.
when it's integrated with the other piece of information, it becomes dangerous.
Right.
So, you know, the principal thrust of Scientology is towards becoming a kind of narcissistic god, you know,
Right.
that you are
Yeah.
going to, you know, and you to
Yeah.
get there, you become ever more selfish, you know.
No, that's true. Yeah, I mean, I would say in my group to elevate, you had to become more tyrannical, you
Yeah,
know, and so it was fostering that as a personality type that would allow you to rise within the group.
yeah.
So if you didn't display those tendencies, which I was not, luckily, not really wired that way, I fell into the more common group of which they called the pussies, the ones who weren't willing to just rip assholes into people, you know, unnecessarily and inaccurately, you know. So yeah, it's interesting because, like you say, I think that's the people that rise in these organizations usually have those type of tendencies, and that's where I'm always interested to see people who have risen to those places and then eventually become kind of the whistleblower potentially. They struggle with sometimes taking ownership of how they even got in that position and the role they played. They just want to now demonize everyone else, but they also contributed in some way,
Oh yeah.
right? And that's where it's always interesting for me to see certain people who clearly have risen up in an organization. They did at some point figure out, okay, this is wrong, but they also exhibited a lot of the very tendencies that they're now, you know, putting the cult leader down for, the group down for. And I think those are things that need to be, you know, self-reflected upon and look at, you know, for yourself to say, what did I do? What role did I play? And look at that part of yourself.
Yeah, and the whole panoply of responses, you know, what benefit did I get from the group? How did I
Right,
help people by using, if I
right,
did, by using the
right,
group's techniques? I can think of times, I mean, mentioning the locational, the idea of grounding. I had a
right,
friend who was a classical guitarist, and it's many, many years ago. You know, I left Scientology 40 years ago, before that.
right,
And he was about to give a performance and he got incredibly nervous. And so I spent 4 minutes giving him a locational. Yeah, look at the
right,
tree. touch the wall, what
Right.
have you. He went in, gave his performance. I talked with him several years later after we were both
Right.
away from Scientology. And he said, I've never been nervous before a performance since. So sometimes you can have a
Exactly.
marked and positive effect. But unfortunately, because it's part of a system that bleeds compassion out of you, that is
Yeah.
turning you into a tool to make money for somebody
Right.
else,
Right.
um, and to put aside any rational criticism or complaint, that the whole thing becomes um, dangerous and overwhelming. I'd also say that a lot of the people, some of the people that get to the top in such groups are people who are compassionate like you, who are
Mhm.
people who are empathetic, and they become what I call weaponized empaths.
Mm.
And through Scientology, I started looking at it. Hubbard, in fact, I think about 1972 on board the ship, he had everybody checked to see if they were a son of light or a son of darkness, a soldier of light or a soldier of darkness, this old Zoroastrian, Manichaean idea
Right.
that we belong to one side of the force or the other. And those
Right.
people who were sons, soldiers of light, he demoted. And those people who were soldiers of darkness, he advanced.
Elevated. No
But
kidding.
both types of people, you can, and I don't want to. There were some very nasty people, but Barem
Yeah.
Perez would be a good example. Who there's a picture of him chucking somebody overboard from the flagship Apollo. Picture photo credit L. Ron Hubbard, and the
Right.
grin on his face at throwing this person 25 feet into the sewage in Corfu Harbour is, you know. But
Yeah.
then you get somebody who is, they're empathetic. My friend Anna Whitfield, for example, who I
Right.
don't think anybody would deny is a genuine, friendly, cordial person. And she was in charge of ethics
Oh,
aboard the
right.
ship, and she had to do terrible things to retain that position. So I think it Scientology can transform people. Let's
Yeah.
put it that way, and that's not
Yeah.
necessarily a good
That makes
idea.
sense. No, it makes sense. I agree. And but I think that's always the part that's challenging for any individual. I know for myself, like that where what I would consider the real work in the recovery process is acknowledging those myriad of experiences, whether positive or negative, and everything gray in between, of when I did things that I look back on and say, "Oh God, I can't believe I said that. I can't believe I behaved that way." Like, those things, but take ownership of them. I think that's really where the lessons learned become, when you realize that under influence, you can become and say and do things that you never imagined you would ever do, and treat people in a way that you perhaps never imagined, and things that you would even say, or go quite against your own personal nature. But
Yep.
that's such an important part of the recovery, is to take ownership of knowing that, yeah, I'm possible. It's possible for me to behave that way because I've already exhibited it. So to think that I can't be that way is just a denial of an actual track record that actually exists.
Mm.
You know?
Yeah, and for me, because I found myself at the center of the independent movement in the UK, people would, come to me and tell me their stories. And
Right.
very soon I was writing a book. It just what there wasn't any other way about it. It was, I write. I've been doing it since I was a kid, but it was like this is fascinating stuff. And the first book that I wrote, which was never published and kept morphing over the years, was called The Scientology War. And it was
No.
about defecting Scientologists, particularly Captain Bill Robertson, who is this absolute lunatic who I came to know very well over a period of 8 months. And he'd been, Hubbard was the Commodore of the Sea Organization. His wife was the Deputy Commodore, and Captain Bill was the second Deputy Commodore. So he was a very high ranking
Right.
Scientologist. He'd founded and run various organizations for Hubbard. He was genuinely a ship's captain. He had taken captain's papers so that he could be the captain of the Apollo. I was told he'd been a Mississippi motorcycle cop during the the burning period, the Mississippi
Oh, right.
burning
Mr.
period.
Bernie. Yeah, yeah.
Um, And he was just outrageous. He was 6'4", larger than life, rode a Harley Davidson, wrote abysmal songs, decorated places with little pennants. And when it came down to it, the thing I learned about him, one of my friends, he moved in with one of my friends and lived with her. And after about 7 or 8 months, I found her weeping in my kitchen when I got up one day. And she said, every weekend, Captain Bill, first of all, she said, we've never had sex. And she's a very attractive woman. And it was kind of, well, he's moved in with you, but so you're in a separate bedroom. We none of us knew that. And he, every Saturday when he could, they would go to an outsized women's clothing store and he'd point to the things he wanted and she'd buy them for him. And she said at 8 o'clock every evening, he would dress up in a gown with heels and sing songs to the mirror, which were to L. Ron Hubbard, whose lover he had been 75 million years before during OT3. His character name was Astor Parmigian. And it was just, so I hadn't even got that far, just the crazy ideas he got. I wrote this thing down and then went, nobody can read this who doesn't know what Scientology is. So it was squeezed into just being a chapter. And then I think it's just a paragraph in Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky. But I was actively investigating. I was trying to find out what had happened from the perspective of, I thought Scientology was a great thing. So what had happened? And Captain Bill said, it's very easy. What's happened is the FBI have taken over Scientology. The FBI are run by the Markabians, who are invaders from another system. 200,000 of them have arrived. They're in Switzerland. They run the world through the Transcendental Meditation. Keep up with me. Transcendental Meditation Organization and the Freemasons, who run everything, as we all know. And he then predicted that in 1986, this was in 1983, that there would be an economic collapse in the world, which would be pinned to the price of gold. So you got all this, and the free zone in Scientology still exists. Captain Bill's followers are still out there, perpetuating his reworking of Scientology, his gospel. What happened to me was that was great. That was a real drench because, for a couple of weeks or something, I believed this nonsense. I'd come out of this group that believed in space aliens and we've all lived in space. And Hubbard told us that the inhabitants, the fourth and fifth invader forces, were on Mars, which is vaguely possible if a bit cold, and Venus. So 400 degrees centigrade median temperature. So they're vaporous beings, But there was all of that sort of nonsense, which wasn't essential to the therapeutic system, wasn't essential to the beliefs. But now it was like, oh yeah, this could be happening. And that degree of paranoia was really useful for me because at the end of a couple of weeks, I'm going, this is mad. This is absolute nonsense. And I think it gave me a willingness to consider different perspectives that I might not have had, to be going, this guy who Hubbard, Hubbard's deputy, is nuts and believes nonsense. How much of that came from Hubbard? And of course, the idea of the Markabians did come from Hubbard. So then a guy called John Hanson, who's a lovely New Zealander, and he was working as a nurse on the oil rigs. So he'd have 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off, get paid very well. 2 weeks off, he worked as a nurse for what came to be called AIDS. He would be going, so he was earning very good money, traveling all over the world. And he'd gone to see this Boston lawyer, Michael Flynn, not to be confused with the general of the same name, who was running 25 cases against Scientology very effectively. And he'd given John this stack of documents. I mean, like stack of documents, 15, 18 inches deep. And John came and he said, I'm never going to bloody read these, so you might as well have them. So I sat and read through the whole stack. I did not stop. I just kept going. And they were Hubbard's college records, school reports, newspaper reports. And what was evident from these things was that Hubbard was a liar.
Yeah.
There were no two ways about it. And what shocked me was that when I then presented that to other people, they would have some justification. So the one I usually use is when I pointed out to a friend that Hubbard in one place says he was crippled and blinded at the end of World War II, in a place called My
Right.
Philosophy. And in another, it's called Communication and Isness, in the 50s, he says that he was in Hollywood a couple of weeks before the end of World War II and beat up 3 petty officers. And I've now seen that justified by many people, but with all sorts of interesting arguments. But this woman just looked at me and said, well, it's obvious he had 2 bodies.
Yeah. Right. There you go. Yeah. That's
They
the answer.
both called Ron Hubbard, or, I mean,
Yeah.
and why didn't he have 3? You know? Um, and I mean, curiously, he seems to have had temporal lobe epilepsy. And one of the common beliefs for people with that is they have a doppelganger. And Hubbard did talk about having a double. So, maybe she was right. Did they kind of then coalesce again afterwards? Then she
Right.
told me, I said, look, and he didn't see combat. Um, his Navy records show that he didn't see combat.
Right.
And she said, well, yes, he did. And I said, well, how do you know? And she said, well, I served with him. And at that point, I could have asked her for her name. I could have asked at that time, I
Right.
could have asked her for the vessel she served on. And I imagine she wouldn't have had a very good memory of it.
Right.
But seeing that the cognitive dissonance overwhelms us, that when
Yeah.
somebody's given such a challenge, they they default to illogic.
Yes.
And that became 40 years ago, the start of my examination of this problem of how can we be open-minded enough to put aside our my side bias, our confirmation bias, and consider the evidence. I
Yeah.
stopped believing in the organization and left it. I stopped believing in Hubbard, but the important thing is, does Scientology work? And so the end of 1983, I had my final auditing sessions with, a supervisor trained at the Flag Land Base, the mecca of technical perfection, who'd been
Right.
supervisor at St. Hill, and with an auditor who was trained at the Flag Land Base, the mecca of technical perfection, who had been an auditor at St. Hill. And so I had people who were fully trained in this. And I just sat there and I'd done OT5, this whole thing about, I'm inhabited by all of these little body thetans. And on the first day, I hadn't signed off on OT5. I kind of walked away from it a year before I left Scientology. I kind of gone,
Right.
this is not for me. I believe in Scientology. I'm not sure about this.
Right.
Indeed, uh, when I was waiting for a session, there was a woman called Stephanie Ryburn, and she had been the owner of the franchise of Scientology that I first got in through. She wasn't there when I turned up. She was in America trying to work out how it was the American franchises were making so much money and she wasn't making any. And so there was this lovely crew of people, all of them graduates of the same university who'd been recruited at the same time. It would often happen. And when Stephanie got back from her travels, she kind of looked at me as if I was, I don't know, something you'd find on the sole of your shoe, perhaps.
Oh.
And she never smiled at me. And I'm kind of going, oh God, she's done these OT levels. She can read my mind, and of course your mind starts going
Right.
haywire once you think somebody can look inside it. So she seemed very sour. She didn't use my name. She never smiled at me. 7 years later, here we are. And she's beaming as she comes out of the waiting room for the OT5 stuff. And she calls me John. She smiles at me first time. She calls me John and she says, isn't it fantastic that Ron's come up with something that cleans up the mess that OT3 makes? So she was somebody who'd had OT3 from Hubbard in
Right.
1968. She spent 14 years, something like, in turmoil because of what it had done to her. So, and I met other people like that. For me, here I am in this session. I'm the center of the independent movement. I'm the chairman of the OT Committee UK, as appointed by Captain Bill. And it's a one-man committee, by the way. And I'm handling public relations. I'm fending off the harassment from Scientology against these groups. I'm getting the groups to stop attacking each other, which was
Right.
just so rampant with the independents. They're squirrels. We're going to do them in. It's like, look, we can hang together or we can hang separately, as Ben Franklin said.
Right.
So I'm doing this stuff, and I sit in this session and kind of go, I don't think I had any body thetans. I don't think these things were actually beings in the same way that I am and that you are. I'm not sure. Then the next day I went and I said, I think they were. The first day I said there may be entities of some kind, but not
Right.
really beings. Very differentiation there. The next day I said I think they were tension units, which is an old Scientology idea lost in the mists of 1951 in a book called Science of Survival. I think they were just things my attention was stuck on in my body.
Right.
And then the third day, I went in and said, I made it all up. I don't think any of this existed. And the poor auditor looked very shocked.
I
You're
can
trained to be
imagine. Yeah.
absolutely deadpan as an auditor. You show no
Right.
response, but she could not. There was a little tremor.
Yeah.
And so I then said, I've been in Scientology for 9 years, but I've never had what is called a PTS rundown. This is the idea that if you've got any bad thoughts about Scientology or Hubbard, you're a potential trouble source, PTS,
Right.
which is
Right.
truthful. And the only reason that's going to happen is because you're involved with somebody who's suppressive, either
Uh,
now or in the past. And
so
that's
you're
what's
being you have to be influenced. This is not your fault. Someone's influencing you. Right.
third party.
Yeah.
You can't think for
The
yourself.
triangulation. Yeah.
That's it.
So
So
when you're at a point where you're saying everything's worked for me up to this point, but this part is not working for me, is compartmentalization allowed or accepted within Scientology, or are you supposed to just yeah,
I 3 days after I finished OT3, I went to the guy who was pretty much in charge of looking after
right,
that, and I said, I don't feel any benefit from it, and I expected to be ordered to do what's called a retread, to redo the course. You have to pay
right.
half the money again,
Again, yeah,
do it
yeah,
all again. And so I was quite surprised when he said, a lot of people find that. Now, this guy had been the technical secretary of the United Kingdom. He had been the highest ranking person in the technology, the auditing thing. So when he said a lot of people find that was a shock. That was
yeah,
something you'd never been told. You'd always been told this will be fantastic, this will be wonderful,
right, right.
you'll have superhuman powers. And he said, you need OT4. So borrowed money and did OT4. And OT4, you find to your horror, is about body thetans that have had drug
Oh,
experiences, and
oh my God.
you have to pay to get them off the
Oh,
junkie stuff. So I did that, and a few days later, I went in and said, I don't really feel any benefit. And he said, a lot of people find that. You need
yeah.
OT5. So I borrowed some money, put myself steeply
So at
in.
least at least he's not making you retread. At least you're getting
Yeah,
that
there
back.
is
Yeah,
that to it, isn't there?
yeah,
Yeah,
right.
that's a
Yeah,
wonderful thing. Um,
yeah,
so I kicked out a few £1,000s out of
right,
nowhere. To pay the thousands through to OT3 had taken me 3 years of
right.
renovating a house. That was all of my profit from renovating a house over 3 years. So I borrowed that and did it, and it was appalling. The guy auditing me smelled,
Oh,
and these are it's a high-ranking Scientologist. And
right,
when I suggested, the room stank, and I suggested he open the window, and he said he couldn't. He couldn't get it open. And you're going, this is a person with superhuman abilities,
right.
and they can't open a window. That's a
Yeah.
bit worrying. So I was assigned to the senior most auditor in the United Kingdom, a man called Richard Rees, when Bill Clinton talked about going to Oxford with a Scientologist.
Mhm.
This was a Scientologist. So
Okay.
he had a master's, I think, in economics from Oxford. So intelligence won't protect you here. Critical thinking won't, of and by itself, protect you. And I finished off my OT5 with him, and it was like sitting in a room with a piece of wood. He had no emotional responses of any kind.
Right.
And in the morning, he would audit Van Morrison, and in the afternoon, he would audit me. And Van
Wow.
Morrison and I both left. Um,
After
so
that, huh?
I came to my final session, and I'd sort of said to Morag, my auditor, Morag Bellman, I've never, I'm the only person I know. I've had 9 years in Scientology. Nobody's ever checked to see if I'm connected to a suppressive person. And she went off and talked with the supervisor, Steve Bisbee. He's a good friend of mine. Remained a
Right.
good friend of mine after I stopped believing. He didn't mind that. Bless
Right.
him. And he said, all right, yeah, see. And she sat there and she said, she asked me the question about, was I connected to a suppressive person? And I hadn't even thought about it. I just said, yes, L. Ron Hubbard. And
Wow.
she blanched. I'd never seen it happen before. She went white, all the blood drained. So,
Right.
but she still held it together and she said, is there anybody else? Something like that. And I just went, I could sit here all day and tell you people who've annoyed me, but this is about L. Ron Hubbard.
Yeah.
I have been
Right.
PTS. My life has been affected. And it was
Right.
a year later. So she had to say, I'd like to indicate that you're a PTS to L. Ron Hubbard, or that L. Ron Hubbard is the suppressive
Yeah.
person. And
Yeah.
she managed to get
Right.
through that. It was a year later that I kind of went, that was my last auditing session, realizing that Scientology is suppressive, that it had
Wow.
harmed and hindered me. And that Ron Hubbard, his determination was to enslave me, not to help me. But
Now, at that stage, you decided to leave, but then did you still believe in the technology though? And even though he
well,
had created it, and you would call him a
suppressive.
tool,
I'd left, and
yeah, it's oppressive.
these people
Yeah.
were in independents.
Right.
So I'd left 3 months before,
Oh, okay.
and so this was the next part of it to be kind of, I'm kind of going, I want to be a rational person, so I don't believe in this body Thetan stuff. But I
Right.
think some of the other parts of Scientology, I mean, there's a group out there, I can't remember what they're called anymore, but they were called the Institute for Research into Metapsychology. And I know this because I gave them their name. I
Right.
was visiting with Sarge Gabodi, Dr. Frank Gabodi, who's a psychiatrist who got into Scientology, and which is a thought. And he was going, we need a new name for our subject because we don't want to do that OT stuff anymore.
Right. Right.
And I'd been over there, they're in Palo Alto in California. I'd
Right.
been over there in 86 and pleaded with Gabodi and David Mayo, who worked with him, to stop doing the OT levels. Whatever
Right.
else they were doing, to stop doing the purification rundown, because I'd found people had died on it.
Yeah.
And that's massive mega doses of vitamins and a
Right.
sauna for 4 hours a day. It's not healthy.
Yeah.
And they should stop doing the OT levels, please. And they just carried on. In 88, when I went back, they'd stopped doing the OT levels, and
Oh,
and they focused down from the 2000 procedures of Scientology to just one, which is what they call traumatic incident reduction, and what Scientologists call new era Dianetics. So it's a process to find, your trauma from this and your previous lives that is inhibiting your
oh,
behavior in
right.
some way. So to undo your karma through recollection, if you like. And
Like,
so I'm kind of going, well, there must be some part of it that, we've seen people get very happy
right.
with this stuff, so there must be something good. And
Right.
what I started to do was I was trained in the data series. And this is said to be the most significant development in logic ever,
The data series.
the
Right.
data series. And
Yeah.
very few Scientologists do the course. It was the most expensive course in Scientology. And that's partly how I happened into it, because I had recruited some people, and I was told that at the Birmingham organization that they'd give me any course I wanted for free as a reward.
Oh,
So I looked at the
nice.
price lists
Yeah. And you say,
and
go
went,
for
oh, that
the,
sounds like
yeah.
fun. I'll do that. And so I did. And my first application was say, well, I've done that. Let me apply that to Scientology. And Scientology was not logical.
Oh, wow.
So, for example, you've got to determine the importance of things. That's part of logic, that there is altered importance and the correct
Right.
importance. And so I'm sort of going, what's the most important material in Scientology? There's nowhere that, there are Hubbard's Scientology work, the Guinness Book of World Records says that is the most prolific authorship of any known person, the creation of Scientology. His fiction is a tiny amount, it's like 3% of his output. The rest is all Scientology, makes him the most prolific author of all time. And also is part of temporal lobe epilepsy, that you have hypergraphia, you can't stop writing. So it does fit in with his condition. So there should be a simple, straightforward determination of what the beliefs of Scientology are. There isn't, not anywhere in Scientology. So in fact, the only place that I know of to this day where you can find out what the principal beliefs of Scientology are is my book, Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky, because I went and collected them. It's like the factors say before the beginning was a cause. We'll start with that. The axioms say life is basically a static. We'll have a bit of that. And these are the core beliefs. And the more I looked at the out points and plus points of the day series, the Scientology is just a ragbag. It's not systematically organized. It's full of contradictions. And Hubbard, in a policy called technical degrade, says everything he's the only person allowed to cancel anything he said, and the date of his utterance does not determine. So you can't say, oh, this is newer, so he meant this. So when he said, when somebody asks for a refund, always give them the money. And when he says, when somebody asks for a refund, don't give them the money. These are both true.
Right.
He then posited a system where we had been implanted many years ago with contradictions, to be or not to be. And that by implanting these things, which he called goals, problems, masses, we become incapable of making decisions. So he was doing the same thing. He'd learned this principle that if you give somebody contradictory information, it paralyzes them. They have to ask for instruction, and Scientology had that built in. Then I applied the data series to the data series, and that was the real revelation I'll give one example of it. It's very simple. The 48th policy letter of the data series is called Out of Sequence, and it says the data series policies must be read in sequence. It's the 48th. You don't find this out unless you've read all the rest. So rather than it being the first thing you read, that you must read these things in sequence, it's the 48th because of its date, because of when it was written. And you go, and that irrationality kind of, and that
was the awakening.
Well, I'd accidentally fallen upon the fundamental method of deconditioning cult involvement, which is, yes, you've got to accept what you're responsible for. Yes, you've got to look at your experience and say, this was beneficial, this was detrimental. Yes, you've got to look at the relationships and how genuine they were. How many of those people talked to you after you left? These friends forever, best friends forever. These are absolutely valid and vital, and Lalich and Tobias, Take Back Your Life is, or Escaping Utopia, also co-written by Lalich. These are really important ways. Steve Hassan's Combating Cult Mind Control, Margaret Singer's Cults in Our Midst, that my own Opening Our Minds are hopefully ways of looking at this. But the one thing I really understood and have understood deeply is the person has to be willing to pull the leader down a peg and say, I question that utterance. And as soon as they, again, the example I've given many times since it happened, I talked with a young woman who, she was 37, who had grown up in Scientology, been horribly abused, and has been paid compensation through the Australian Royal Commission as a consequence of that. And she went public with that abuse, so I'm not violating any confidence. But she, at age 37 was asking me, and she got a medical degree. She's a really smart woman. She
Right.
started a master's. She's saying, is it true that reality is an agreement, as L. Ron Hubbard says, in our first meeting? And I said, yes. If you're the hypnotist, then everything you
Yeah.
see is down to an agreement
Right.
that I've enforced upon you. Otherwise, no, it's out
Yeah.
there, like it or lump it. It
Exactly.
doesn't care about you. It's real, and it's not bending all the time in accordance with our beliefs. It's not constructed from, as Hubbard said, we're all chanting space particle position, space particle
Right.
position. I'm not,
Yeah.
I'm definitely
No,
not.
and I think the point you raised, I experienced within my group as well, as far as being able to humanize the leader rather than divinitize them, so to speak, right?
Very
So
much.
once you humanize them, then your critical thinking kicks in and all sorts of hypocrisies and controversial issues start to raise up, things that you had initially experienced early on, right?
Mm.
And what I've noticed for the people that I would call the true believers or the devotees that are still very much locked into the um, brainwashing or mind control, whatever way you want to frame it, they still hold the leader in this position
Yes.
with divinity. And that seems to be the obstacle,
Mm.
not being able, even though I can have a conversation with them and say, well, can we at least agree he was a liar? Right? Oh, well, what do you mean? What do you mean? And then going through, well, he lied about his name, he lied about his background, he lied about his whole
Mm.
history growing up, and then he lied about his drug use, he lied about his sexual activities which led to him getting AIDS and all these sort of things. It's like, oh, well, he was in a body and those bring problems. And I'm like, well, there are plenty of people in a body that aren't doing those things and certainly don't call themselves spiritual leaders. And it's like, well, we'll have to agree to disagree. And it's remarkable. So you can even have a conversation, but information coming in to the contrary of their beliefs, it's like they've got earmuffs
Mm.
and they just can't retain it.
Yeah, cognitive dissonance writ large.
Yeah,
If our fervor is too great, if our beliefs are too rigid,
right,
then it doesn't matter how good the evidence is, it will not penetrate. I mean, a
right,
week after I spoke to this woman and put this to her, she came back and she said she'd used scented laundry conditioner, fabric conditioner. And we both knew what she was talking about. We hadn't had any conversation about this arcane thing called the hygiene hat,
right,
where people joining the C organization are told you cannot have anything scented, no soaps, no shampoos, nothing with a scent on, because the Commodore, Ron Hubbard, is scent phobic. That's not the expression they use. Rajneesh had the same thing. They had an
right.
oversensitivity in smell. Hubbard had to have paint that had no scent.
Wow.
His rooms had to be painted with the special stuff. Rooms would in his dwellings were lined with visqueen so that no scents could penetrate, nothing could get in. He would
Wow.
say that the psychiatrists are ruling the world using rose-scented perfume.
Interesting.
Lunatic. But what my friend had done was it was now all right for her to question something and to do something, and
Right.
she found out that it was fine. Once somebody has that process stimulated in them, they will keep on going.
Yeah.
And I've
Right.
seen the opposite. I've seen, for example, my friend Cyril Vosper, who wrote The Mindbenders about Scientology, was in for 14 years, wrote the book in 68, had met Hubbard. He was actually in a book called Have You Lived Before This Life, where
Right.
people would, these lunatic descriptions of past lives. And he was both an auditor and somebody audited, what's called a pre-clear in
Right.
this book. The first edition has his name in. Later editions no longer have his name, or indeed the names of many other people who left Scientology afterwards. For
Wow.
some reason, I'm not sure why that is. There's probably a genuine good reason for it.
Oh, I'm
But
sure. I'm
Cyril,
sure.
years later, to my amazement, I was working on a documentary, The Secret World of L. Ron Hubbard, which I'm quite pleased with. It was a good piece. You know, the producer did a really good job, Jill Robinson. But she gave me all of the interviews that she'd done. And as you know, you'll do an hour interview, but you'll use 2 minutes.
Right.
So
Right.
I got all of the interviews. And it was only when I started doing things for Tony Ortega, which was 2013, I went, oh, I've got all of these interviews back from 96 or whenever. Let's
Right.
digitize them and stick them up. And the
Right.
first time I saw my friend Cyril, by this time no longer with us, talking about past lives. And he quite evidently still believed in this simplistic model of past lives. He'd not actually gone off and looked at the Hindu or Buddhist sophisticated ideas about this, or understood that to Buddhists and Hindus, this is the fear of the eternal return. They're not going, oh, brilliant, I'll do it in my next life.
Yeah.
They're going, oh, I don't want another life. I've had it. You know, this is
Right. Right.
They're getting off
Right.
the wheel of suffering. So you've got a
Right.
completely opposed view that's not really been thought through. And
Yeah.
often that will happen, that somebody leaves the group and they'll still believe in third partying. They'll still believe in the missed withhold, the misunderstood word, but they won't use those words anymore. And it's
Right.
almost like you've pulled the top off the sting, but the sting's still in there.
Yeah. No,
You know,
I think that's the more common scenario is people will find their way out of a groove, but will they actually take the steps to truly recover and reclaim their life before they got involved? And very often, I think more than not, people try to put it in the rearview mirror and just write it off as an experience and not think about it and try to move forward. And that's just not the way trauma works. You know, trauma will stay in place if you don't lean into it and deal with it and take ownership of it. And that work, I find, is the one that's, you know, brings out the life lessons and the silver lining to the whole experience.
Yeah.
But people will resist that because there's a lot of, as we talked about earlier, a lot of accountability that you have to self-reflect upon on the role you played in getting yourself in this situation. And that's brings up a lot of ego issues and people will resist that. And that's, you know, that's when we all become our own worst enemy.
Yeah, and we will keep finding ourselves in the same kind of trouble. So the amount of cult hopping that I've watched friends doing, that, you know, I had 2 friends in California, both, I mean, one of them with a master's degree, the other a high-ranking US Air Force pilot, a lieutenant colonel. And they both went from the absurd beliefs of Scientology into Santeria, so Brazilian voodoo. And I don't, you know, I do regard voodoo and Santeria as genuine religions, as genuine as Christianity, Buddhism, or anything else. And I think the demonization of voodoo after the genocidal attacks by US military in the 1930s in Haiti, which had just written out of history, but they broke spirit drums, they killed people. It was terrible. And Hollywood got this whole zombie thing from there. So I'm not going there. I'm not saying, oh, this is a stupid belief, but it is a belief that is at odds with scientific rationalism. Let's put it that way. And if you're a chicken, it's not something that you look forward to as far as religious beliefs
They
go.
do a lot of sacrifices, right?
Yeah. So yeah, and it's not even, you're quite right that trauma has to be dealt with, but also indoctrination has to be dealt with. So I recommend that people do form little groups and talk about this and say, well, do I still believe that? Is it valuable to me? Is it true? Is it useful? When Hubbard said honesty is sanity, should we therefore go, L. Ron Hubbard was insane? I don't think so. I don't think that dishonesty is a mark of insanity. I think that's wrong. So let's put that aside. I do think he was insane, though. So
I think that's pretty obvious.
Grand. I'm exhausted now.
Yes, I know. It is, but it is fascinating because you know, we all get to it in different ways. to find this awakening to say, okay, this isn't working for me.
Yeah.
But as I tell people, I go, that's when the real work begins,
Mm.
right? I think in a way, even though cult life, and as you said, it wasn't so bad for you. You weren't
Mm.
getting,
Fine.
the abusive side. But for most of us, it's usually a very abusive environment.
Mm.
And so it feels good to be able to leave that abusive environment. But as you're referencing right now, if you don't get into what the indoctrination was that allowed you that situation to emerge and how that
Mm.
happened and what techniques were involved, so that in many ways you can forgive yourself, you really do stay stuck,
Mm.
and that's why the information is so important and the ability to self-reflect and to be accountable for how you contributed to your own demise in this sense, but with the understanding that this has been a journey that allows you to learn more about who you are and the world we live in. Because as we've talked about many times, we live in a cultish society, so you can't escape this stuff. And it's
Yeah.
just that we all have different versions of it, but it really is important to recognize that just figuring out that you're in a situation that maybe feels unhealthy or toxic, getting away from it is not enough. You've got to really lean into the trauma and figure out how it will happen and
Yeah.
uh, and learn from it.
And become. It's not a matter of you're a perfectly formed, utterly sensible, rational human being who then gets into a cult.
Right,
As Robert Kaufman in his wonderful book Inside Scientology, or How I Became a Superman, um,
right.
he explains that he left the science fiction world of Scientology and re-entered the science fiction world of reality. And the the process of growing to become a unique self, to
Right.
become who you are, the most of who you are, the best of who you are,
Mhm.
at some point in your life means questioning your beliefs and
Yeah.
saying, and if you've been in a cult, after I left Scientology, which is 40 years ago, I
Yeah.
felt for a year I was just high. It was wonderful not having to conform my thinking to
Right.
anybody else. I could think what I damn well liked. And that allowed me to go, oh, this is an advantage. You've talked, I first spoke to you because I'd heard you talking with Steve Hassan, and you said
Right.
being in a cult was a badge of honor. And I
Yeah.
really like that
Yeah.
thought that we actually, the secrets were revealed to us, but
Yeah.
they were not what we thought they were. They were about
Exactly.
becoming
Yeah.
human,
Yeah. No, it's
being,
true.
mm,
Yeah. I mean, I can say like um was vulnerable to the cult because I was seeking understanding about myself and the world around me. And
mm,
I thought the cult was going to provide those answers, but I can say they did provide the answers, just not in the way that I ever imagined.
yeah,
So, I got what I asked for, which
mm,
I'm happy for it. And it's just some expensive, harsh courses in the School of Hard Knocks.
yeah,
So be it. Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. And I'm, I feel incredibly fortunate, because for me, the traumatic part of the cult experience was being harassed for
Right.
16
Yeah,
years
right.
solid on a daily
Exactly. Yeah, the
basis.
aftermath for you was much more abusive than while you're in it.
Yeah, and quite overwhelming, when you're being sued in the
Right.
US and in your own country, and
Yeah.
you're being all of these nasty, nasty allegations are being made about you in little pamphlets
Fair
and whatever.
game at its best, right?
Okay. And to now be able to say, at the age of 69, I'm the happiest I've been since I was, I don't know, 5 years old.
Right,
That that and all of the complexity and difficulty of life that all teenagers experience. They're not the best years of your life. Don't be ridiculous. All of that and trying to make sense of the world.
right,
Um, it makes enough sense to me now, whereas throughout Scientology, it never did.
right,
It was always difficult. It was, well, I'll do the next level and then I'll be. And then I
right,
realized all the people around me were like, let's sign off this level and we'll do the next level. And then we'll do the next level and the next level and the next. And then they arrive at this point where they're given status within the group so that now I remember when I'd done OT3, a friend of mine, it's a can't remember his name, Mark, he's a poet from Birmingham, lovely bloke. He would come up to do OT levels, and he's, John, I know you're not meant to tell me, but what are the fantastic abilities you've now got? And you don't want to say, well, I've got a much greater sense of disappointment than I had before.
Yeah, right. Really, really excelling in that area. Yes. Yeah.
I'd like
Oh
my
my
money
goodness.
back, please. But so it goes. Anyway, lovely.
All right. Well,
Let's
good as always to chat, John. And yeah, we'll keep forging forward, and we're all a work in progress, right?
absolutely
Yeah.
until the end. And
All right.
who knows
We'll
what
see,
happens then.
we'll
But
see you next time.
yeah, great
Okay.
talking. Thanks so
All
much,
right.
Hoyt. And
Cheers.
thanks
Bye.
to everybody for watching. And please make comments. We will alert Hoyt. And I may or may not answer comments. I apologize for that. But I'm always
All right.
busy for some reason. I don't know why. So I should spend time lying around on beaches, but don't really
There you
like
go.
it, So, okay, thanks so much.
All right. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.